Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Supporting Call Takers in the Moment, Practical Lessons from AI Use in 911, sponsored by Aurelian. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping notes to go over. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. You have joined in listen-only mode. This helps avoid background noise throughout the webinar. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so please feel free to ask your questions at any time throughout the webinar. The team will answer them at the end of the presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please use the question box in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. With that, I'm excited to introduce our speakers. Max Keenan is the co-founder and CEO of Aurelian, which helps 911 centers reduce non-emergency call volume so dispatchers can stay focused on real emergencies. Now I'm going to turn it over to Max.
Hey guys, thanks a lot for joining another one of our webinars. I'm really excited to kind of get this group together. One of the common questions I always hear is really like, there's a lot of tools for 911 call takers. How should we be thinking about these tools in ways that are most productive? This is one of the questions I have thoughts on, but I don't think my thoughts are necessarily the most valuable. I never took calls. And so what I've kind of gotten here is three of my, say now, close friends from two centers across the US to kind of talk a little bit about this, have a discussion, one from the vendor side, my side, and from the actual side of being a real call taker out in the field. So that's a little bit of our agenda today. And really what we're going to start off with is kind of giving a little bit of introductions of them. Everyone knows who I am for the most part, but I'll let Derek kick us off here.
I'm Derek Wilson. I'm an operations manager at Snohomish County 911. Been here about 18 years. I started as a call taker and kind of worked my way up here. Excited working with Aurelian. We deployed AVA for non-emergency a little over a year ago. And now we've kind of moved into this next part here with Cora and getting that in the hands of our call takers out there on the floor.
Peter?
My name's Peter. I'm a supervisor here at Snohomish County 911. I've been here for about 8.5 years. Started as a call taker, worked my way up. In my current role, I still take some calls, so it's pretty exciting to get to work with Aurelian and try and figure out next steps to harness technology in our favor.
And finally,
Hello.
Cody.
Thanks, Max. Hi, my name is Cody Post. I'm a recovering 911 center director, currently responsible for managing the CAD, RMS, and mobile software for the City of Akron Police Department and supporting technology inside of our 911 center.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us and kind of, orient us a little bit on why we're actually here. One of the things I wanted to talk a lot about is like, what is the actual ideal role of applying AI in call taking, like specifically call taking? And I think one of the things that's kind of been a recurrent theme, and one of the things I want to kick us off with, is that there's a lot of hype around AI. Obviously, all of you all are early adopters in it, so you've bought into the hype to some extent. But really, I kind of want to understand like what's actually useful, and like how can we think about tools when you have this constrained screen real estate, right? Although there's different levels of that constraint. I say this as Snohomish has what, like 3 54-inch monitors at each call taking position. But like, can you kind of walk through when you guys are thinking about technology, what at a high level are you kind of looking for to make the lives of call takers easier? And I'll kind of let you start off with this, Derek.
I think specific when you start talking about 911 call taking, emergency call taking, I definitely go towards the side of an assist tool, a guidance tool, something that adds, I'd say, value without necessarily adding effort or additional problems or steps or considerations. A significant amount of the technologies that we deploy in the center, even if valuable, they often come with a new task, a new effort, or almost maybe a downside, depending on what exactly it is and how it impacts that workflow. Call takers have a sensitive and tried and true workflow. And so it's important that as we deploy new technologies, we make sure that we're accounting for that and not just adding more chances for confusion or more difficulty to get the same task done.
Could you talk about that a little bit more? Like, I think this is one of the most interesting things for me is that most of the tools that have been added in the last 20 years in public safety increase the mental workload, at least, of call takers, right? It's adding another thing for them to look at. It's adding another responsibility. And like, ideally it increases the level of service to the responders and the caller, but it's really at the cost of the call taker.
Yeah, or at least with impact to the call taker. I look at the deployment of AVA. So AI for a non-emergency line. It's a good example of no regrets, totally worth it. You know, we had 180,000 calls last year, and 80,000 of them were handled by AVA. So the stats are there to prove the value, but it was yet another technology, another login for them, another portal they had to access, and a new workflow to learn. Completely worth it, but it did have a workflow impact. And I think it's fair that when we deploy new technologies here, while the people who make those decisions might not be the ones taking the call, it can be an oversight sometimes just how much of an impact that might actually be to their workflow. So when we started looking at something like Cora or the future of what's next after non-emergency AI, that's when I really wanted to say, hey, this is a tool for the call takers. It should be influenced by them, and it should really help them achieve the expectations we've already set, help them do what they're already doing, but in a much better, more efficient way without adding more hurdles.
And then, so I kind of want to point in this, like one of the things we talked about, like doing things in a better, more efficient way. I think an important point to understand is like, what are the actual problems you're trying to solve with any technology that you're adding? And at high level, I talk a lot about how 911 call taking is hard. Peter, can you talk a little bit about some of those, maybe hard points that you felt firsthand and that you see with new members of your team as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of it ties into the expectations that we place on the call takers, both for level of service and for the structure of our policy. So it's natural that there's a lot of policy surrounding taking calls to ensure that you provide the right level of service to the public, you mitigate liability to the agency. And I mean, at our center, we're a busy center. We have a large population. We have a lot of different call types. So we have hundreds of pages of policies. So you take that and you combine that with back-to-back calls, and there are stressful calls, there are high critical incidents, but just the constant calls, and you have to remember all these things as you're going from call to call. So when we implement new technologies, something that's important is, like you guys have talked about, it's not increasing the mental workload. And to me, at least, part of that question comes to how easy can we implement this in a way that doesn't create so much new change all of a sudden that they can't process it.
Yeah, and then that's a piece you brought up there I want to hear Cody's point on. So we talk about like change within the center. Like obviously, call takers hate change. And I think a lot of it's justified, right? Like we talked about this expectation. You're demanded, you're expected to pretty much be perfect on every single call. And then somebody goes in who isn't even actively taking calls and changes your workflow. So like, Cody, when you think about this from like that like change management aspect, that like workflow changing perspective, how do you think about, as like an IT manager, evaluating new technologies and understanding when it's worthwhile to change workflows and when it's not?
There's a saying that I like to use sometimes, or that I've heard, is the juice worth the squeeze. If we're going to implement something inside the dispatch center for the dispatchers, like Derek and you talked about at the beginning, a lot of things in 911 have required the dispatchers to do more instead of doing less. I think back to the first iteration of video from 911. It wasn't a linear path. There wasn't an easy way to do it. It required the call taker to send a link and then convince the caller to click on a link on their phone. It didn't make their life easier. And was the benefit of having video from the caller on every 911 call, is it actually beneficial to them? Most of the time it really isn't. There are great success stories out there where it was very helpful. It helped make a difference in the call. There's a story about a call taker watching CPR in progress and correcting bad CPR. But is the juice worth the squeeze? And when you implement something and you have to train all your dispatchers on it, at the end of the day, is it worth taking them out of the center, having them do a 1 or 2 hour in service, and then having to give them the attention they need once it's in the center to make sure that they're comfortable using it, that they're comfortable deploying it in the center. Because sitting through a classroom and watching a PowerPoint about it is one thing, getting in the center, using it live with callers is another. They're going to have questions they didn't think of at the time. Can you support it long term through all the shifts? So the basic question in the change management aspect is the juice worth the squeeze? Is it worth it to implement it? And then also thinking about the global center as a whole. What are we implementing right now? What changes are we going through? Our center moved locations just a few years ago, and one of the things that kind of happened around that is we stopped changing things. We stopped implementing new things because we knew that the move itself was going to put a burden on the dispatchers to adjust from the basic things like parking in a new space, navigating their new space, getting used to their new workplace that they have never been to. That all is a burden. And so when you go to implement something new, you have to think about what are you doing right now? What's new in the center? Where are we staffing wise? Where are we trainee wise? And it's really hard. It's kind of like that keyhole block where you're just dropping something in where you can make it work.
Yeah, and when you talk about lots of new capabilities showing up fast, I think that's pretty critical to consider. We're in a situation where, in my opinion, some of the, I'd say CAD vendors specifically, they still have a longer time frame for integrations to occur at a much slower pace than this technology is coming out. So as these new technologies come out and are available, and they might have, I'd say, irrefutable value, the lack of integration brings up that whole squeeze effort, right? The juice is there. I want the juice, but whether or not we can squeeze it, that really comes down to what's this look like on that person's workflow? How can we get it so that it overlays their current system, if not integrate? And unfortunately, historically, you're looking at a year or more from engaging with vendors to get an integration up and running. So I don't think the industry's caught up yet there, which just adds more, I'd say, to the consideration part when you're trying to analyze new technology offerings.
So we've talked a lot about like some of the problems with new technology, and like especially on the historical side. We talked about some of the problems with AI more specifically. But what is the actual ideal role of it? How do you all think about integrating it into your PSAP specifically?
AI in general, or specific to Irreliant?
AI in general.
I mean, I think we're seeing it trickle through in a couple different ways, a couple different programs and workflows. And for us, it's that, assessment of what can this do? What's it proposed to do, but what does it actually do? Is there a benefit for us? I'm big on data. If we've got a problem and we need to find a solution, that's great. I'm not necessarily a fan of seeing a new product and then finding your problem that it might solve. So for us, I'd say we're definitely innovative and we're curious. So that's led us kind of down this path. We were able to sole source Ava pretty early on. And then from that, kind of leveraged all of those successes into what we're doing now with Irreliant. We've got a few other vendors as well for different applications that are AI assisted. So I think that as people tread slowly and kind of have successes, they'll build off those, and centers realize, hey, this can work if you do it right. If you go out there and buy something hot off, the press that may not really be solving a problem you need or has too much squeeze with it, you might have to fall back a little bit. But I think we're trying to be careful, but we're also trying not to restrict ourselves from taking advantage of kind of this current situation.
No, that makes sense. So one of the things that you all brought up that I really like and I want to talk a little bit more about is kind of this, I would say, the recurring trap of adding new technology and the promise of having better quality of service, oftentimes at the cost of the telecommunicator. And I think about this because one of the hard balances that I see every day is you are planning for the black swan events, the 1 in 100,000, the 1 in 10,000 that you are trying to best prepare for. Like Cody mentioned, the CPR case that doesn't really go appropriately, right? And being able to make that correction. And it's easy to kind of find what I would consider like point solutions that fix one problem, but then at the cost of like the mental capacity in some ways of the call taker. So maybe this is like, how do you think about when, maybe there's a chance that this is useful in one case, evaluating what is the total usefulness of this compared to the cost of adding it? Cody kind of framed this as, is the juice worth the squeeze? I think it can be really hard to tell. So I'm curious, like, how do you think about telling that? Derek, you mentioned like stats and data. Could you dive a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you got to look at the different perspectives of the stakeholders involved. And sure, in my position, when I'm looking at stats and data and aggregate all of that together to try and, maybe account for call answer times or overall happiness and I'd say success, those are all important things to consider, but it's equally important that we're able to involve people from the other side of that as well, right? The people taking the calls, the people supervising those who take the calls. I feel like we've done a pretty good job, and always room to grow for sure at my agency of trying to account for those through whether it's a work group or some sort of mechanism to solicit feedback, even if it's just for some sort of guidance. We did that with Ava. We had a team of dispatchers, supervisors, and managers that worked together to kind of conceptualize this giant leap to embracing non-emergency AI, which we didn't really have anything to expect from. Same thing with some of the other technologies. We try pretty hard to solicit volunteers. We're lucky enough to have a pretty large pool of dispatchers and supervisors, so we're usually able to get a few. But I think getting that feedback early on, especially when there's a chance that it can be captured, is important. A lot of the solutions you might get are very much pre-built or built and not necessarily configurable. So you definitely have to balance, soliciting feedback and input and advice. If you can't account for it or actually take action on it, you got to be careful with that delivery. But even worst case scenario, it at least gives you a chance to maybe consider what you're doing and how you're doing it, or at least get ahead of some of that. By the time I deploy a new technology on that floor, they've heard about it for a while, hopefully. Several of them have seen it. Even better if they've used it, then it becomes kind of something that we can all help and speak to.
Makes sense. And when we think about this, like adding work, not necessarily valuable. One of the ones that I see with a fair number of our customers is that they've bought transcription. And they kind of bought transcription. And Cody, I see you making a face, so I'm going to let you talk about this.
Running up to this webinar, we had a short conversation, and I said at the time, and I still kind of believe this, and I know Peter's going to have a counterpoint to this, and I really want him to say it, but if I think about, when you think about AI in 911, and when it comes to the 911 call, the linear path of the call, and when you're taking the information, you're putting it in CAD. Personally, sometimes I think that the transcription comes too late in the process to help you, in terms that if you're going to use it as a copy and paste method, if you're trying to grab single snippets or lines, that's kind of too late. Most dispatchers can type faster than that. And if it's a hot call, if it's an important call, you're going to run all the information into CAD. Is the transcription really going to help you? I think transcription, and I know, and I'm changing my opinion on this after some things Peter said, but I think the transcription is a really great tool after the fact. It's a really great tool for keyword notifications, to bring the supervisors all on the same page that are inside the room, to maybe let everybody else know, to be used as a tool for doing QA, QI, that you can use AI against the transcription of what they were supposed to do. It just feels like in the heat of the moment, it's going to be too slow because the dispatcher can process things faster.
I mean, is it fair to say that I think Peter's the only one here who still takes calls? I think that's, an important thing to consider, kind of with what I was speaking. And the part of transcription is, transcription was sold as the newest and greatest thing pretty quickly as soon as they could start transcribing. And that really fell short for us of, what can you do with that transcription? And I think there's value potentially for it to be on calls, but it isn't some giant problem solver in itself. It's a transcription of what you're already taking. You may need to reference something, but at the end of the day, it's not faster than what you're hearing, and it's not going to be perfect as you would have typed it.
I agree with both Derek and Cody. I think that transcription, as it came out, was sold as just as transcription. There was no method of harnessing that and no ideas for improving upon it. And I think in my experience so far, I found that it's not the line for line transcription all the time that helps during the call. Cody's right, that's great after the call. But what helps from live transcription during the call is harnessing it to get secondary confirmation from the data you're hearing. So you caught that license plate, you caught that name, you caught that date of birth, whatever it was, or you didn't catch it. It gives you a chance to kind of refer back to it and get that secondary confirmation of, oh, I did hear that name right. I did get the spelling right. Or maybe you're already asking the caller again, but mentally you can move on because you have that data there. I've been remarkably impressed with, if there's a little bit of a language barrier or they have a name that's maybe hard to spell, it's not a common spelling, the transcription catches that a lot more accurately than I do the first time. So again, it takes that mental load off of being able to start moving on mentally to what I have to do next in the call. It has those ongoing benefits during the call, even if it's just a little bit slower. I'm not taking and pasting that information into the call, but again, that secondary confirmation is huge.
So one piece that you kind of mentioned here, Derek, and the term that you used was may, and I really like that because I think what makes this like tool adoption process really hard, one of the things that I think is really interesting to look at, is it's easy to see when tools are useful in certain situations. It's hard sometimes to tell how often those situations are. And when you're thinking about this in terms of fundamentally changing people's workflows, that like when something is valuable needs to be really often. I say this with like, we have a lot of customers that have transcription. A lot of customers who have paid a lot of money for transcription. I was talking to one the other day and I was on site, I was visiting the center, and I noticed none of them had transcription open. None of their call takers had the live transcript open. And I asked, and I was like, hey, and basically their conclusion was like, we need a policy for this. And I think in reality, like the tool should be valuable enough that the call takers want to use it. And so to Peter's point, like, yes, there might be those situations where there's that one name that's hard to pronounce, and then you end up using transcription to reference that spelling. If the frequency of that isn't very high, the vast majority of your call takers will never adopt it into their workflows. There will be some early adopters, but there won't be many.
Yeah, especially depending on how it's viewed too, because Peter's referencing not just word for word transcription as it occurred concurrently. He's referencing, taking that transcription, reformatting it, calling out specific things of value, and putting them in places that are logical. Because even then, a running transcript is still kind of a mess to try and look at while you're still trying to talk. So taking that transcription and even harnessing the formatting and the types of information that it can call out, all of those are how you actually get that massive value from that foundation. But just the foundation itself, a running log, is not something really you can ingest in real time.
So one of the things that I think we should, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, jumping on that as well. Having something that's configurable, and this is going back a little bit to what Derek said before, but the feedback process, configuration, being able to harness it, all of those are important to create buy-in with dispatchers, and buy-in is what generates usage. So if you can prove that you have a product that is solid, but then you can establish that through a feedback process, that's what creates the buy-in, rather than just coming in with a product and saying, here you go, make the best of it.
So we get a question from the audience. Do you have policies and procedures in place prior to adding any new technology, and how far ahead is training done prior to implementation of the new technology? I think I have an idea of what I would consider best practice, but I'd be curious between Snow and Akron, how do you guys handle this kind of differently?
It really depends on the technology. For the AVA, the non-emergency AI, people were stressing out, I'd say both at Aurelian and both at Snohomish 1, because they wanted a tangible policy. They wanted everything explained well in advance. And we went live on a Monday. It wasn't until Saturday night that I actually sent out the, hey, here's how you log in instructions. And that was because it was changing every day. As soon as I would draft something, it was no longer relevant, or we would learn and adapt and change. And I would say that the only thing worse than maybe a delayed training is retraining updates and changes. If you learn a new technology and you follow the sheet and you sign the policy, and then 2 days later it changes, and then 7 days later it changes. It gets hard to, remember what's the most current, and that kind of, I'd say, deflates the chance to get in the flow and understand it and move forward. So some technologies we definitely, get ahead of. That's where we can leverage that, I think, here at Semi One a little better, because we do have that opt-in. We know a little bit more about how this is going to work because we've got people using it that are getting kind of a sneak peek, getting a chance to help craft some of that. But it definitely is, I'd say, the technology dependent on how we're going to be able to get ahead of that.
So I want to say what stressed me out with you all was the fact that there was no training. It wasn't about the training being late or the training being early. You guys did not want training.
We did training. We did training day of for the people that were there. We started with, we came in early. I came in early, and we touch pointed with the 7 people that were going to be in the portal. We had stuff pre-drafted for them to refer to, but we really, I had learned from our feedback from our dispatchers and call takers that had been on that work group that reading anything and then trying to do it wasn't the answer. A hands-on kind of explanation with that as the backbone was the point. And so that's what happened, is everybody got a touch point before we actually flipped any switches. Everybody got a one-on-one pretty quickly, covered the basics, and ran through that cheat sheet and that, I guess, FAQ they had. And then we built off of that going forward. Like Peter said, we have hundreds of pages of policy procedure. Having a policy and procedure doesn't do you anything unless people are going to actually recognize it, adhere to it, and fall back to reference. So we've kind of gone through this mix of updating some of ours in the past, as well as trying to maybe make them vendor agnostic and spell out concept, what we do, how we do. Not necessarily this vendor sells us this program, this is what you must do with it. Just because policy or not, practice is what's happening, and so we'd really try to, I'd say, take a more realistic approach at that.
Cody, what about you all?
Yeah, I would love to say that we have a hard and fast policy on how what time training happens in relation to when we go live. I think training in all instances in a dispatch center is best had like just in time training, like as close to go live as you can get, because if you space it out too long, they're not going to really remember. And most of us in the business know that adult learners learn most by doing, not necessarily by sitting through death by PowerPoint. So, get them the basics, get them the information, answer their questions, get them as comfortable as you can, and make it as close to your go live as you can. And we all know that we all could ours is a good example. Well intentioned. We had just in time training. We had it in the middle of the summer. They went through the training, then they went to the center and they worked with it for a couple hours. We ran it off and on for a month as we were doing these training classes to try to get everybody exposure. We ran it overnight, and then we had an issue and we couldn't use it for several months. So we had all this training, we did a good job, we had everybody educated, and then we had to let it sit on the shelf for a little bit due to some internal agency issues. But then when we came back to it, most of it was the same, but it had changed. So again, right before that, the 2 Wednesdays before we turned it back on, we did just in time training with our dispatchers, and then we did one-on-ones with the people that couldn't be there. Still to this day, we don't have a codified or written SOP. Our policy setter, which is our lieutenant, she put out a message say, hey, here's the rule set, here's the game plan for right now. This is very flexible because this is entirely in flux and we're developing this as we go. So I think being upfront with people and letting them know, hey, I would love to give you a policy and a procedure, but in the same sense, it's dynamic enough that if I write something down, it's going to change soon. And I don't want you, and we both don't want to have to constantly keep up with a changing procedure. And a lot of places, especially in union shops, they push that SOP because a lot of people have this fear of discipline that, oh, if I don't do this right, I'm going to get disciplined. Well, I think all of us can understand that in the heat of the moment when you're deploying something, having hard and fast rules to discipline somebody against, first off, are you really going to take the time to do that because you're working through a developing process? You're not gonna run them up against the wall on the policy because it's going to have changed so much. So the fear that kind of comes with not having a written SOP, I have to have written instructions. Listen, I personally have wanted that before in the past, but a lot of it is developing too quickly. A lot of things change, and you're hitting a moving target that unfortunately isn't just moving like the little duck on the wheel at the carnival. It's attached to the side of a semi going down the highway, and so many things could change it. So many things can push your deployment. So as close to, when it comes to training, as close to deployment as you can. And when it comes to SOPs, everybody has to be flexible and understand that things are going to change.
So my take here is that I think there's that ideal way, which is like, I agree with you, Cody. Like, you need one. I think the training needs to be in person, and it needs to be just in time, every single time. I like with us, one of the things I always like doing is in-person training right into test runs. So you kind of go from the classroom to reality as fast as possible. I think that's really important. I think you should have SOPs, and you should have detailed policy and procedure on how to use it right before you go live. And I think like the training and the test runs can help you solidify the actual reality of how it's going to work. And then you can build SOPs on that reality. One of my frustrations with some SOPs is that they're based on a fairy tale world, and reality does not necessarily work as smoothly or cleanly as you would hope. And so I like having it like kind of reared in actual practice. But no, appreciate the question. I think it's
even
great.
having an ideal world, right? Like Cody mentioned, hey, Cody, how easy is it for you to get all of your dispatchers to take an hour-and-a-half classroom training?
Oh, first off, yeah, one of the things we didn't talk about, timelines. To approve an SOP, we have to, first off, once we decide we're going to make it and sign it, I think it has to be posted for 14 business days before it can go into effect. And then getting it to that point takes sometimes months and weeks of work through all the approval processes. And like Derek said, getting all your dispatchers in the same room, I think we have to have our schedule published 2 weeks in advance or more than that, like the training schedule. So, aligning all of these holes in the Swiss cheese that come up is so hard. Sorry, Derek.
That's the balance. Exactly. I mean, my dispatchers work 12-hour shifts. So, and we don't do mandatory overtime because of those 12-hour shifts. So how do I, even for a couple hours, that's where a lot of that just-in-time training is one-on-one driven, and kind of carved out.
So I think this is a really good segue into the next piece I want to talk about, which is, we're talking about just-in-time training. We're talking about over-the-shoulder training. It's 911 call taking is really hard. And Peter, you hit it on this a little bit, but I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper on this. There's a few pieces that I think, are particularly difficult. I would love to hear from your guys' end. What do you see? I kind of like this group because we have two very different PSAPs. We have a consolidated center that serves 18 different agencies in the Pacific Northwest, and we have a singular, agency, Akron Police Department, in the middle of Ohio. Obviously,
we have 43 agencies.
What's that?
We have 43 agencies.
43 agencies, 18 law enforcement, right?
Yes.
So what do you, obviously you see different problems with this. I'd love to talk about, Peter, on what makes it hard being a consolidated center, and why do you have 1,000+ pages of SOPs?
I think one of the things that makes it so hard being consolidated and having the number of agencies that we do is different agencies want the same type of incident handled in different ways. So this applies to both call taking and police dispatch. Usually it applies to the dispatch side more than the call taking side. We're pretty much processing the calls the same way every time. But at least on the dispatch side, we have fire departments who send units as soon as they know it's an aid call, and you have fire departments who want the aid call to be completely processed before they ever send an aid unit, so they know what to send. And that's just one example. When it comes to call taking, we have some agencies have animal control officers and others don't. Some agencies can handle vehicle lockouts and others can't. And when you have so many agencies and you're covering a population of 800,000 people, you kind of always are wondering when you take those calls, or trying to remember, because it's one of those extra details, it's one of those hundreds of pages of policy that's tucked away of, this police department can do lockouts, but only if these 2 units are on duty. And so really anything that we can do to help our call takers to put data in front of them to mitigate how much they have to think about that. You know, we have printouts for the desks. We have a internal wiki with all of our policies and cheat sheets and stuff like that, but there's so many different places they have to go to find that really we just want somewhere where we can put it where they don't have to go looking.
Yeah, that can go both ways, right? If you remember everything because you're the perfect dispatcher, great. But that also means when things change and you don't check the resource, you don't catch that change. Or the alternative, if you take this safer route and you always look to validate, even if you think you know, great. But then you're having to physically go and look while you've got a caller on the phone. So it's kind of I'd say a lose-lose when you think about how are you going to have that. It's too much information. It changes fast enough that you can't just rely on it.
I think have worked in enough PSAPs that every time you drive a dispatcher to paper, you lose the game. As soon as you drive them to a paper Mavis book on a working structure fire, you're adding 3 or 4 minutes to getting that mutual aid going, because they have to find the book, they have to find the right Mavis list in the book, they have to call all the right phone numbers. So as soon as you drive them to paper, even if it's an electronic resource, that's almost like paper nowadays. Especially, you guys said you have a wiki, we have a giant SOP folder. You got to dig through that thing and find what you're looking for, and you're not going to be able to do that fast. It's almost like you need something that's always going to front the policy based on what's going on in the center, what's going on in the room. So you have instant access to it, and it always tells you what's going to do, and it's always accurate. How many times, Peter and Derek, Peter's still in the call center, but when I was a new dispatcher, every center I've ever worked in, they're really bad at updating their paper reference binders, like especially depending on how many there are. So you'll pull a binder and you instantly open it and you look down and it's old. It's old by the date. That the policy is not even close to what that says. So, paper slows you down, and you got to then keep it up. And not everybody's great at keeping paper policy, paper manuals up to date, where electronics is a little bit easier, as long as it's easy to navigate and it's very clickable. It just, none of us have the time or the architecture to kind of build those kind of things.
Yeah, I'd say the vast majority of our dispatcher and call takers have their own, personal notes, books, binders, some sort of reference. And while that's great, and I did the same, I also kind of view that as hopefully I can say a problem in the past at some point, where if someone's resorting to collecting their own information to use to help them process calls or dispatch radios, we're losing an opportunity there to, have this real-time information change or update that doesn't impact them. Because if I make the changes in the policy and we communicate it, I also don't know what Max had in his binder, and Max has to catch that and remember it's in his binder and change his binder now. And so I think we're definitely on the cusp of something where having to rely on yourself to get the information you're going to need, or you have found yourself needing and swore you'd never have that gap again, and you couldn't find it because somebody changed the keyword, right? They deleted the old resource, added it, updated, but they changed the title of it. So what worked yesterday to find that information doesn't work now while you're on a call. That, those are the things that set people up, I think, to trust their own notes, which again, it just puts more burden on them.
One piece we talked about a little bit, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into, is when this information changes in real time. Whether that be like Snohomish County, you guys just had a bunch of flooding. Now you've had this real-time information changing for evacuation orders, for even anything you could possibly really imagine. How do you even convey that information to the floor?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the situation, right? The flooding was quite the extreme. As those alerts are going out, as things are changing, we're passing information through chat. Email's not the best for that. That's very much, I'd say, a reactive kind of real-time response to it. If you look at, I'd say, a consistent but a little simpler problem would be for a process we call level 2, which is basically when one of our agencies is at capacity, police agencies, or they're taxed with a major critical incident, they can place themselves on level 2, meaning non-priority, non-in-progress events. They're essentially not processing, and we have a different mechanism for how we ingest that call, what we tell the caller, and basically we try to stop a little bit of the bleeding for just, the normal routine coming in during these high activity efforts. The problem with that workflow is, though, that the police officers tell the dispatcher, hey, put us on level 2. The dispatchers try and communicate that to the people on the other end of the room who are taking calls, but it can be really hard to autopilot and remember that when you're pounding call after call. Oops, Linwood PD is on level 2. I need to do something different. And so Peter takes a call, forgets that, puts it in, only to have to call that person back and change the expectations that he delivered with how that call went. So I would say we do the best we can, but we're always trying workarounds. We're always trying, this is the best way we can. And usually we don't have a product that I would say is tailor-made for actually addressing some of these real live and or fluctuating events like that.
How'd you think about, like, I know recently there was the measles outbreak in Seattle and Snohomish County. How'd you think about, like, basically making your team aware that if someone's calling in for, flu-like symptoms, it could potentially be measles?
Yeah, so we did prepare for that, right? Last, I think Thursday, we announced that there was a measles outbreak in our county. There were 3 confirmed cases from someone who had traveled out of state, and they reached that point where we had to, the media took it, everybody ran. So we kind of try to get ahead of that a little bit on 2 ends. We use a medical protocol system that has a mechanism in there for, hey, when it's activated, you have to use this additional effort. But that's a manual effort. So the burden becomes to the call takers. You've got to process medical calls as normal, as expected. However, if they have a fever and rash, you have to also open up this other mechanism and use it as well. So leveraging information just right off the gate on that Thursday, we talked through, can we make it so that if fever and rash is part of that transcript, that there's an alert reminder to prompt someone. So instead of, hoping that staff read that email, hoping they understood the actual intent there, and just reacting to that, we've got this, ideally they still read all that and they still know, and they got their one-on-one training and reminder, but also while taking that call, oh yeah, this person said both fever and rash, here we are. So I think, you're giving, I'd say, actionable information only when relevant, and that's the real difference here. We push all this information out, all these exceptions that violate the norms, and we do that, expecting people to remember it when it's not the norm, and it's an exception, and they may not have even read that email.
Yeah, I think that kind of segues into one of the pieces I wanted to talk about today, which is like the next generation of software isn't going to necessarily be reactive. It's not going to require the call taker or the dispatcher to do something. It's going to understand from that call transcript what needs to be done and then surface information or maybe even take action on their behalf. This is like, how can we simplify the cognitive load so that telecommunicators are spending more and more time on the actual calls and less time thinking about your SOPs? We talked about this kind of at a high level with this idea of like, hey, what if we could surface these SOPs more proactively, right? What if instead of having to go through your 1,000 pages or go through their singular little doc that they have or the post-it notes that they keep up, what if they can actually just have software that kind of works for them? One of the things that, especially when I started working in public safety, 3 years ago now, that everyone talked about was this kind of branded terminology of like the single pane of glass. It became a very trendy term. Everyone was trying to create the next single pane of glass. The truth is you already have a single pane of glass, and it's your CAD. Nothing is really going to replace that. Like, your CAD is the single pane of glass. It is where all information should live. It's where all information should be. But as Derek mentioned, connecting that information to CAD is non-trivially difficult. I think a year is sometimes a conservative timeline for an integration. And so when we think about getting this information in one place, one of the things that kind of became clear for us was that we had to do it through a heads-up display. We had to overlay CAD. Like, if we were going to build software that was going to help call takers, we had to do it in a way that actually helped call takers. And what became really clear was it has to be something that fits into workflows. It has to be software that's kind of predictive of their needs rather than reactive of their actions. And in many ways, it had to use this transcript to best serve them. I like to think about this as the 911 call audio is the source of truth. It tells you what is happening. It tells you, really, in many cases, what action should be taken. And it's on us, it's on AI to kind of leverage that information to make the lives of call takers easier. One of the things that we've kind of talked about over and over again is this idea of like just-in-time and over-the-shoulder training. I think this is like, when we think about software, the ideal solution for AI is being that over-the-shoulder trainer. It's providing gentle reminders to help people make sure that they're on the right track. Derek, we've talked about this a lot, and Cody, us as well, and honestly with all three of you, about the concept of like QA, right? And my take with QA is that QA is only as good as your QI. Like the timelines from when a bad call happens to you reviewing that call and then you suggesting improvements on that call are often like weeks, even for like, the fastest moving centers. What that means is that by the time that happens, the call taker, the very first thing that they always say is, right, like, I've taken hundreds of calls between this point and now. Why are you looking at this call? And unless, there are very constructive moments to learn from QA, but really the goal of software, the goal of AI should be, how can we stop that QA from ever being needed? How can we give like real-time live guidance to call takers so that they're performing the right things at the right times and yielding the right outcomes? Peter, I know this is a long part of spiel on my end, but I'm curious, you guys were early testers of Cora. How have you kind of seen this in practice?
So I think one of the things that's been beneficial is we have the ability to implement all of the questions from our call routes into it. And so it's made me catch myself missing questions, either questions I wouldn't have asked or that I would have asked in the incorrect order, or, it kind of gives me the ability to check myself as I go rather than, running into issues later. As I ask those questions, it's configurable. So it recognizes the answers to those questions and can give me the data for that secondary confirmation that I talked about earlier. If I ask what color vehicle are they driving, it can give me that information. So it can show me, hey, I need to ask this because I haven't, but it can give me that secondary confirmation if I miss the data that I got when I asked the question. Yeah.
I think, and with that, I'm not interested in a protocol system. I think protocol systems are inherently going to evolve just because, most of them out there, especially prior to this AI kind of craze right now, have been, what do I manually select based on what the caller said, right? And that interpretation gap and that manual effort is what really, I think, adds a bunch of what, in my opinion, is the negativity around protocols go. So balancing, with what Peter said about it being some sort of reminder and assistive tool, the win for me there is there's definitely calls that your call taker knows exactly what maybe the policy says, but for whatever reason, there's an exception to why they're not, or why they're deviating maybe from that order. And that makes total sense. And I want our staff to have that power, as they currently do, to, adjust in that gray area. So something like, with Cora, where it's like you said earlier, Max, it's a gentle reminder. It's almost passive for almost all of the efforts, so that as you're taking your call, you have a visual indicator of what you might not have asked yet. And it's still on you to decide if you want to ask it or not. And then, yes, there's some active alerting there that gets some of those exceptions and emergency changes out there that we really need to call out. But the ability to basically have, it's essentially pulling up the call processing guide automatically for you and paging down as you take the call, that's an interactive type of validation that feels, and the feedback so far is it's very natural to assist with it.
So you mentioned passive. How do you think about, we've been talking about a lot of like new technology tends to end up being a distraction. How do you make sure it's not a distraction? And this is a question that we just came in.
That to me, I have been on the top of that hill from the get-go here with, it has to get that buy-in Peter talked about. It can't be a distraction. If it's a live transcript just feeding information and it's distracting, people are going to close it, people are going to hide it, or people are going to ignore it. And once they realize that it's too much information, it's not helpful, or even worse, maybe it's incorrect information, they're going to ignore it and they're never going to circle back on it as things improve. So for us, that's where, while we're in this development phase and while changes are still happening, engage with your staff, find the people. There's people in your center who want to be involved in this or would love to get a chance to maybe be super critical or even be super helpful. Either way, I think still both options are great, because those are the people that are going to use this in the end, no matter what, the entire center. So it only helps us to get that feedback sooner. Don't fall for the trap that you know best because you used to be, a call taker. I haven't answered a 911 call in probably 7 years now, and I'm hopefully the first to admit that I shouldn't be out there acting like I take calls every day. So you really need to pull in your experts, pull in your power users, and pull in those who are critical or constructive to take account for all of that. And then hopefully you have a vendor that actually gives a feedback mechanism with a positive loop where feedback can come in, feedback can be accounted for, and changes can actually be made in some sort of timeline that the reporter of that feedback sees a value in change. I don't think our staff has ever participated in giving feedback as much as they did with Ava. And that's because they saw those changes happening in almost real time, if not every other day. I send out a survey link to my staff, and maybe 10% of them are going to click on that link and do it. We asked them to give feedback through Aurelian's mechanism, and boy, did we get feedback. And that only helped.
Makes sense. One of the pieces, I know we've got 8 minutes left, I want to talk a little bit about is that, and I think is a stress for everyone, is every PSAP is unique. And Cody, I think you have a little bit of an interesting take on this, where you might be against this.
So doing what I've done in the industry and seeing PSAPs from all over Ohio, talking to all the PSAPs in all over Ohio, working in all different PSAPs. I came from an environment that was very regional, like Derek. We didn't have 43 agencies, but we had around 20, to a single discipline, not discipline, but a single agency PSAP. And I've always encountered dispatchers that think that they're special in the sense that we only do it this way here. We are very special because nobody has this problem, or nobody does it like we do it. And the reality is if you travel, if you go to some of the conferences, dispatch centers are actually really similar from one to the other. They're generally the same. The only general difference is the name on the door. Now that comes back with the whole regionalization thing. Derek and Peter have that same problem that every regional center has, is each department does something differently. As much as you drive them to do it all the same way, there's always going to be those little nuances that just beat you to death. But aside from some really winning cultures that have really figured it out, the dispatchers are pretty similar. They're really hard on each other. They're very critical of each other because they always want to do something really, really well, and that's okay. But most of the issues are very similar, no matter where you are, ironically.
And I think I kind of disagree a little bit with Cody here. And I think that this is something that when you think about software is really important, is that kind of directionally, maybe 95% of PSAPs are similar, right? Or maybe 95% of the average PSAP is similar to another PSAP. I think the way I described it last is they're kind of like fingerprints, where they're really similar, but they're all unique. And I think what's hard is that when you look at solutions generally, if this was for our company, if something was covered 95% of the use cases for a private sector company, it'd probably be fine. I wouldn't be excited, I wouldn't be upset, I would be fine with it. When you're demanding perfection, that little bit of difference matters a lot. Those little uniquenesses that every PSAP has needs to actually be accounted for, because that is what's going to yield the best outcome on every single call. And I think one of the things we've talked about a little bit here is this idea of customization of products. Ideally, you want your product to feel like it was purpose-built for you. In reality, it actually requires a little bit more of a conscious decision from the vendor. It can't be customizable, it needs to be configurable. There needs to be an understanding that Akron PD is going to handle things entirely different than Snow 911 is going to handle it. And we can't enforce the same workflows, the same procedures, the same standards on one PSAP and the other. And I think that configurability piece is, I think, really important. We talk about
fully commit to that. A lot of the CAD vendors out there, they They are configurable. They are highly configurable, but they are so system-wide. It's one setting. You can decide A or B, and then you can decide C or D, but you can't have, well, this agency wants A and this one wants D. So I think that's, don't limit your product to be configurable one way as if it's going to work, this way, black and white.
And to your point, Derek, like that's inside your own center. Say, software that it has global settings, but then you jump in a place like Snow, and all of a sudden he needs the settings to say 43 different things. He needs the configuration to be done 43 different ways. And sometimes, a lot of times, unfortunately, the software comes back, and the vendor comes back, the commercial partner comes back and says, well, I'm sorry, it can only be this way. And you're like, well, that's fantastic. It works if we only had one agency, but we have 43 agencies and they're doing everything different. So I think configurable is great as long as you get it not too granular, but understand that you now have call centers with all these different agencies. You may need to be able to program it 43 different ways.
I think vendors sometimes take the trap of you shouldn't be that needy. I've had that look. I've had that said in so many words, but there's an element of realism there, right? With those 43 agencies, I have some fire departments that are volunteer only, and I have some that are top 5, top 10 busiest in the state. So we have, unfortunately, one setting to set up for, hey, when do pages go out? And that's not great for people who have a siren, who need volunteers to respond, when it's the same setting as people who are in a station with a full-blown multi-million-dollar station alerting package. And so unfortunately, we have to pick. And so that leads us to gaps where some people get too much alerting and some people don't get enough. And that's an unfortunate, line to have to draw. But again, it's sure we're needy and yeah, we're unique, I'll say it, but realistically, there is a nuance there.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. Thank you both, for 3 of you, for coming out and talking a little bit about AI and 911, about the difficulties of call takers. I was going to open it up for questions, but we went through a few in the middle of it, and now we're pretty much at time. So I'm sorry if I missed any of them. Always happy to kind of answer them one-off, or if you want to reach out through LinkedIn or email, always available. But one last thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is how we're using AI in real time to provide live guidance for call takers. Peter mentioned this a little bit, how we're kind of providing that level of over-the-shoulder training to make sure that call takers are following SOPs correctly and surfacing the information even as it changes in real time, even as that evacuation order is being pushed out, even as the measles outbreak information is being pushed out. We're being able to actually surface that information for call takers and being able to help them make the right decisions. And really, in many ways, like the goal of this product, to make the lives of call takers just a little bit easier, to make that job a little bit easier, to kind of really be that over-the-shoulder trainer that can simplify the workloads as much as possible. We've been really lucky to work with some great partners on this, and I appreciate Cody and Derek and Peter to come out, talk a little bit about high level how we're reviewing this space, the problems that we've seen, and how we think that this is a fresh and exciting new approach in actually making the roles and responsibilities of call takers easier. And I want to say thank you to APCO for hosting us and having another webinar. It's been a pleasure working with you all on these.
All right, that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you to our presenters, to all of our speakers, and to our sponsor, Aurelian. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This concludes our webinar.
Thanks.